Hello. I'm going to talk with you about the strike that started this past Friday when the UAW reached impasse the night before in its negotiations with the so-called Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis. Stellantis is the new name for Chrysler. Each of those companies has a national agreement with the UAW that expired late Thursday night. And then the UAW, led by a new president, Shawn Fain, launched a selective strike against each of the companies. He chose one assembly plant of each company and went on strike. And what I want to talk about is how basic principles in our field can help us understand what's happening in this strike and also what's likely to occur, what the dynamics may well be over the next several days and even conceivably next several weeks if the strike continues. First thing to note is that Shawn Fain chose a novel strategy. In the past, the UAW had successfully, in its negotiations, always targeted one particular company if it reached impasse in negotiations over contract renewal. They adopted that strategy because, in their view, it put particular pressure on one of the Big Three who was struck when the other two companies continued to produce vehicles. So consumers who couldn't find their car for the struck company could then go off to one of the other two companies and buy a car. In addition, by having workers continue to work at the other two non-struck companies, they continued to contribute to the union's strike fund, and that allowed them to have more resources if the strike lasted. Well, Fain adopted a new approach. He chose this selective strike, and he's already revealed that he's considering spreading the strike further. He's announced a deadline of the end of this week, if they haven't reached agreement, to escalate this strike. Let me just say a few things about Mr. Fain and remind you of how he came to be the president of the UAW. There was a scandal surrounding two of the previous presidents of the UAW, Gary Jones and Dennis Williams, who were found to have committed financial malfeasance. They resigned and were eventually sent to jail. And then the union, under the terms of a consent agreement with the Department of Justice, conducted the first direct election to choose a president of the union. In the past, the so-called Ruther coalition had dominated the executive officers, and new candidates to run either for president or other executive positions were always selected by the existing leadership and then voted on by delegates, not directly by the workers. So in any case, Shawn Fain came somewhat out of the blue. He had been an electrician in an auto plant. He had served as part of the Ruther coalition in a mid-level union office. And he ran against several candidates, but the key alternative candidate was Ray Curry, who was part of the Ruther coalition and was then serving as the interim president before the election. So in any case, Shawn Fain won, but I will note, and it may come into play if the strike lasts, that he won by a rather small margin. He beat Ray Curry by a few hundred votes. There was a runoff between the two of them from a previous election with more candidates. And as well, what's interesting too was that as a sign of some of the troubles within the UAW, only 12% of the eligible UAW members actually voted in that election. And then there was a runoff, and then the percent voting went up a little bit to 14%. But it's not exactly as if Shawn Fain won with an overwhelming mandate. Keep that in mind. That may influence the course of events. So in any case, what we have here is an impasse. Shawn Fain has articulated a wide range of demands. Some of them seem quite expected. He wants a significant wage increase. He would like to reinstitute a cost of living escalator clause. He wants workers to receive some payment for the income they lost due to the recent high inflation, given the absence of a cost of living adjustment. He wants some other changes. He wants to reduce the number of temporary workers and have existing temporary workers converted to regular status. He wants to raise the lower tier of pay within auto set in 2008 when they first agreed to create a lower tier and keep the higher tier workers at their existing wage. The current wage, by the way, is around $32 an hour, plus a significant amount of money that goes to a very solid benefit package. Some other things that Sean's asking for are rather unusual. He's asking and demanding that the companies reduce workers' regular work hours to 32 hours, but keep their pay all the way up to 40 hours. He wants the big three to ensure that the new electric vehicle battery plants are fully unionized and are paying union top scale wages up to the top tier. And he's made some other demands and all. So how, using principles of our field, how do we understand what's going on here? Well, basically, my assessment is the auto workers have substantial bargaining leverage now. They have bargaining power because they have a substantial strike threat. The 150,000 workers at the big three can't be replaced. They have a lot of solidarity, even though Shawn Fain's newly elected. My sense is they're loyal to him in the sense that if he calls, as he's done, calls a strike, they're going to go out. And they'll stay out, at least for a substantial period of time. They're also bolstered by the fact that the auto companies have been making a good profit. Sales are up. The companies have a lot to lose if the strike lasts for a long while. Keep in mind the companies face a lot of competitive pressure now. That's another issue that looms in the background. A little bit more than 50% of the cars and trucks sold this year in the United States are assembled by workers that are not covered by a UAW contract. Some of those cars and trucks arrive in the form of imports from foreign producers, but a substantial number of those cars and trucks are assembled in the so-called transplants, the plants owned by foreign-based companies, Nissan, Honda, Toyota, Subaru, BMW, Mercedes. And those transplants have been operating non-union. There have been efforts by the UAW to organize them unsuccessfully. So how does that matter? Well, it matters because it bolsters the resolve of the companies to avoid paying wages and benefits that are far out of line with the compensation received by workers who work in the transplants or build those vehicles that are imported. It also matters because in the deep background, in the long run, it's also a problem for the UAW. As the non-union sector grows, they face a more severe, in the language of our field, a more severe wage employment trade-off. As the wage and benefits that they earn go up, sadly, the trade-off they face is that demand for products will shift to the other producers now that there are all these alternative sources of cars and trucks, and they may face some employment threats. They also face the threat, they're wrestling with this directly, from EV vehicles, electric battery-powered plants. The battery factories are not currently unionized extensively. There's only one unionized battery plant in the U.S. Others are being built by LG and SK, South Korean-based companies, some in partnership with the big three. Some of the batteries are being imported from mainland China and elsewhere. And that's an issue confronting both the management side and the union side. And then as well, there's also seems to be evidence accumulating that putting together, assembling a electric battery-powered vehicle doesn't require as much labor. So employment's likely to decline. Gary Jones and many others, I think rightfully so, are calling for the need for a so-called just transition to EV-powered vehicles. And that's an element that looms in the background in these negotiations. Now, what's likely to happen? Well, anyone experienced in our field, and many of you are, will know there isn't a simple answer to that. It depends on the parties and whether they can find a compromise. I think there are compromises out there that are available to the parties, and I think it's a question about whether they can find those, whether they can get past some of the rhetoric that each side has been articulating and cut a deal. I suspect the companies are going to have to substantially increase the offer beyond what they've currently offered. And Mr. Fain, I suspect, is going to have to come down from a number of his demands and forge a compromise. I think it's likely to be a compromise that provides a very strong, healthy increase in pay and benefits for the workers. Perhaps they'll return to the old traditional formula that prevailed for 30 years or more in the industry. 3% a year in base pay increases, of cost of living adjustment over the terms of a multi-year contract. And I also suspect that there'll be other improvements, potentially converting some of those temporary workers to regular status, raising the pay of the lower tier auto workers and all. And so I think there's potential solutions, but as we know in our field, the parties sometimes struggle to find those solutions, even in the face of the high cost to both the workers when they're striking. They lose a lot of income during any strike, especially if the strike spreads to more of the plants of the companies, or even potentially becomes an industry-wide strike. And the management itself loses, lost production, lost profits and sales. Management has to worry, by the way, when people go out and buy a vehicle, whether it's imports or a car made by one of the transplants, it may just not be one vehicle that they buy. When people shift brands, they often stay with that new brand. So there are real costs to both sides of a continuing strike. And as we know, that's why most negotiations end up without an impasse. The data showed 95% of collective bargaining negotiations in the U.S. reach a settlement, and only a 5% go to impasse. Well, we have an impasse underway. Time will tell how long it lasts. I myself hope the parties in the not too distant future find a middle ground between what Mr. Fain is asking for and what the companies are currently offering. The long history of the UAW is actually quite a proud and accomplished one. It's too bad some of the recent presidents, it's really quite a shame regarding the financial malfeasance that they were engaged in, but the UAW historically was a pathbreaker in U.S. collective bargaining. They brought early multi-year contracts with that 3% base pay increase, cost of living increases. They were the ones to provide elaborate pensions and health insurance, so they can show the way for many other workers in the United States, and I hope they can do so in finding a path to resolve this dispute. Well, take care. We'll see what happens.